Opening the center for rapid piece development, this pawn thrust immediately fights for central influence. Instantly creating asymmetrical pawn structures, the Sicilian defense injects immediate dynamic imbalance into the game. Developing the knight here immediately fights for central squares and prepares for kingside castling, aiming for a robust pawn structure. Developing this knight immediately contests central influence, setting the stage for a sharp Sicilian defense battle. Cracking open the center immediately creates dynamic imbalances and fighting chances. Recapturing opens central files, immediately contesting the pawn majority and creating dynamic imbalances. Asserting central influence, this knight boldly claims the d4 square, preparing for swift piece development and potential queenside pressure. Unleashing a knight to challenge the center pawn, this develops a piece while preparing to strike at white's central occupation. Developing the knight efficiently, this square aims to control central squares and prepare for kingside castling. Solidifying the center pawn structure and preparing for potential queenside development, this choice subtly enhances black's central presence. Developing the bishop to e2 prepares kingside castling and bolsters the central pawn structure, a sound positional choice that prioritizes king safety and a harmonious piece setup for the upcoming middle game complexities. Solidifying the pawn chain, black prepares to develop the kingside, aiming for a robust structure that can weather white's central pressure and potentially launch counterplay on the queen side. Safeguarding the monarch with a swift castling maneuver, white prioritizes king safety while preparing to activate the rook on the newly opened g-file, setting the stage for potential kingside pressure. Solidifying the pawn structure and preparing for castle gives black excellent defensive coverage, creating a firm setup that anticipates the upcoming middle game struggle for central control. A subtle but potent repositioning, shielding the monarch from potential diagonal threats and preparing to redeploy the knight to a more active square, perhaps f4 or g3, aiming to support an eventual kingside attack. A timely castling maneuver solidifies the king's safety behind a pawn shield, preparing for a more active middle game development and freeing the rook from its corner. Launching a pawn storm on the kingside, this aggressive advance instantly increases white's pawn mass, aiming to cramp black's position and potentially open lines towards the enemy king. However, it also subtly weakens the d4 square and creates potential targets for black's pieces down the newly opened e-file. Bringing the bishop to d7 shores up the kingside defense and prepares for potential queenside activity, a subtle yet crucial step in fortifying black's position against white's aggressive pawn push. Repositioning the knight to b3 creates a flexible out-of-the-way square, ready to redeploy to c5 or d4 should the opportunity arise, while also securing the pawn chain and preparing for potential queenside expansion. This subtle maneuver avoids committing the knight to more immediately contested central squares and prepares for a potential queenside minority attack or a repositioning to support a central pawn push. Activating the rook on the open c-file, placing pressure and preparing for a potential queenside initiative, simultaneously deterring white's pawn push further down the queenside. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for potential central advances, this maneuver simultaneously offers a retreat square for the knight on c3 should black's queenside pressure demand it, while also eyeing the d4 square and contributing to the long-term control of key diagonals. This repositioning of the queen prepares to bring pressure to bear on the queen side, potentially supporting an advance on the c-file or even eyeing the king side through a discovered attack. Shifting the bishop to the open diagonal prepares to challenge black's control of the center and potentially attack the king side if the opportunity arises, while simultaneously offering support for future pawn pushes like g4 or h4. Targeting white's queenside, black's knight embarks on an intriguing journey towards the queenside, aiming to unseat white's well-placed bishop on e3. This maneuver hints at a strategic shift, potentially creating weaknesses for white's pawn structure and opening up lines for black's pieces. It's a bold initiative that could disrupt white's comfortable development and force them to react to black's initiative. Exchanging the knight on the rim immediately relieves some positional pressure, though it does open the file for potential black infiltration later. A trade-off for simplifying the central pawn structure and clearing a path for the queen to potentially redeploy. Recapturing the pawn with the queen immediately resolves the tension on the file, bringing a key piece into the fight and preparing to contest the open file. White bolsters queenside activity and eyes the light squares, potentially preparing a future advance like c3 and b4 to gain space on that flank. Securing the queenside pawn structure with b6 aims to solidify the queenside defenses and potentially prepare for queenside expansion later, creating a more resilient pawn chain against any potential white incursions, while also eyeing a potential maneuver to challenge white's bishop on e3. Safeguarding the king's immediate vicinity, white secures the pawn structure against potential knight incursions to b4, subtly preparing for future queenside expansion. A sensible placement, reinforcing the d-file and preparing to challenge white's queenside structure, potentially by supporting a future d5 push or simply contesting central influence through pawn tension. Focusing white's queen on the d3 square now aims to coordinate its pressure alongside the d-pawn and the bishop on e3, preparing for a potential central pawn push or a flanking maneuver to exploit black's somewhat passive queen and rook development on the queenside. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside, this audacious advance aims to disrupt white's seemingly solid setup and create immediate counterplay, forcing white to react decisively to the unfolding queenside dynamic and the potential for pawn chains to develop. White's recent string of seemingly passive maneuvering now culminates in a forceful assertion of control over the central files. By placing a rook on the c-file, white directly challenges black's nascent queenside expansion, threatening to unravel its structure and deny any comfortable retreat for its pieces. This maneuver not only prepares to contest the open c-file, but also subtly hints at a potential pawn push on the queenside, aiming to restrict black's minor pieces further. The board is now ripe for a strategic clash, as white seeks to exploit the space gained, while black must find a way to equalize pressure or face mounting positional difficulties. Black strengthens their queenside pawn chain, preparing for potential pawn advances like b5 and preparing to contest the file, a strategic decision aimed at expanding influence and creating counterplay. Shifting the queen back to d2 reestablishes a more balanced posture, subtly preparing for potential pawn advances or defensive maneuvers on the kingside, while keeping a watchful eye on the queenside pressure initiated by black's recent pawn push. The queen repositions, eyeing the queenside pawns, but the immediate threat of white's central pawns advancing might be the more pressing concern, potentially trapping her or creating weaknesses for black's pieces. The queen's repositioning to f2 aims to solidify the kingside pawn structure, preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm or simply creating a safer haven from the open files. Notice the subtle influence this has on the central tension, as the queen no longer directly contests the queenside squares black has been eyeing with the rook and queen. This might signal a shift in white's intentions, moving away from immediate queenside pressure towards a more strategic buildup. The rook's repositioning to b8 subtly reinforces control over the b-file, preventing white's queen from easily infiltrating that sector and creating a more robust defensive structure for black's queenside pawns. A bold bid to pry open the kingside begins, aiming to destabilize black's castled position and initiate a powerful pawn storm that could overwhelm the defender, though it simultaneously weakens white's own king by creating potential entry points and sacrificing critical pawn cover. Black reinforces their bishop's control over the queenside diagonals, preparing to contest the crucial b-file and potentially unleash their own attacking chances. Pushing the g-pawn further creates a fascinating dynamic, initiating a kingside pawn storm that immediately challenges black's defensive structure and seeks to exploit the slight immobility of the knight on a5. This aggressive thrust aims to gain vital space, potentially opening lines for white's rooks and queen, while simultaneously pressuring black's kingside defenses and forcing uncomfortable decisions regarding piece placement. Initiating a crucial pawn storm on the kingside often invites counterplay on the flanks, and here black strategically anchors the knight to bolster the queenside pawn advance, preparing to challenge white's encroaching pawns and potentially open lines for counter-aggression. A sharp declaration of intent, h4 begins a pawn storm with the ambition of cracking open Black's king's defenses, aiming to exploit the open g-file that the doubled pawns have created and to gain space on the king side. A bold attempt to redefine the board's dynamic, this move wrests initiative from White's queenside pressure and redirects it towards a critical central pawn advance. Black cleverly utilizes the queen's new perch to eye White's king and potentially disrupt White's pawn structure. It's a gamble, certainly, asking White how they intend to parry the incoming pressure, but it also invites White to overextend and potentially create weaknesses if not handled with extreme precision. The interplay of centralized queens and potential pawn breaks is becoming the defining feature of this tense middle game. White opens a dangerous avenue toward Black's king, intending to exploit the d7 knight's current immobility while simultaneously creating potential mating threats on the king side. Pushing the f-pawn here aggressively tries to disrupt White's pawn chain and open lines for Black's pieces, but it significantly weakens the king side and potentially creates a target on g6 should White decide to advance further. Steering the queen into the heart of the pawn storm, this maneuver is less about direct attack and more about preparing a subtle positional squeeze, aiming to exploit the dark squares that are becoming increasingly vulnerable. This maneuver aims to activate the knight, shifting it from its passive central post to a more dynamic attacking square, potentially disrupting White's pawn structure on the king side and seeking counterplay on the queen side. Unlocking the c-file and potentially creating immediate diagonal threats against the Black king seems to be the primary ambition here, sacrificing a bishop for what appears to be an aggressive pawn push on the queen side. The capture on c5 liberates the pawn chain and brings the knight closer to the queenside action, creating a dynamic imbalance on the board. Prepare for a sharp tactical battle. Reasserting control over the crucial central files, this deployment of the rook prepares to contest the open e-file, a vital artery for both queenside and kingside operations. The intention is to create pressure and restrict Black's burgeoning queenside expansion, potentially setting up sacrifices or positional advantages later on. Challenging the pawn chain with this pawn thrust opens a dynamic new phase, aiming to disrupt White's queenside structure and potentially create a passed pawn. Opening that queenside passage with the pawn capture immediately opens lines, potentially targeting Black's exposed king if White can consolidate central control and exploit the weakened structure arising from the pawn exchange. Seizing the open c-file is paramount, and this recapture, while seemingly simple, instantly activates the rook, creating immediate pressure down the now vital conduit towards White's queenside. Shifting the knight to d1 reestablishes a crucial defensive outpost, preparing to contest control of the d-file and potentially repositioning the knight for a central presence or even a kingside assault, while simultaneously offering prophylaxis against any immediate threats on the queenside. Unlocking the queenside potential and preparing to contest the open c-file, Black redirects their bishop towards a more active diagonal, potentially eyeing pawn advances or supporting an eventual e5 break. White aims to unbalance the position and create attacking chances on the kingside by sharpening the pawn thrusts, potentially opening lines for the queen and bishop after the pawn advances. Unleashing a tactical storm, Black gambles that the immediate pawn capture will disrupt White's queenside structure more than open lines for their own king. Unlocking the d-file with immediate purpose, White's bishop retreats, now poised to support a potential d5 advance and create threats against Black's somewhat exposed king. Challenging the central pawn structure now unveils attacking potential on the kingside, while securing the rook's active participation. Unleashing a calculated offensive, White aims to exploit the slight disarray of Black's queenside pawn structure and pressure the king. The queen's redeployment to b3 offers a dual threat, supporting a potential pawn push on the queenside or rerouting for an attack on the kingside, perhaps via c4 or b4. This aggressive repositioning forces Black to remain vigilant and consider defensive maneuvers, as the king's shelter appears less secure now. Sacrificing the bishop offers a daring counterstrike, aiming to shatter White's pawn shield around the king and disrupt their coordinated pieces. Unleashing a devastating check, white pierces the pawn shield and immediately exposes the black king to overwhelming pressure. This aggressive queen sacrifice, while superficially appearing to give up material, brilliantly opens lines and creates unavoidable tactical threats that black, with his pieces defensively clustered and vulnerable, will struggle immensely to parry. Seeking refuge for his sovereign, the monarch retreats to the safety of the back rank, a predictable but necessary action after the king was exposed by the queen's aggressive foray. Unleashing a pawn storm to crack open the kingside, white sacrifices material for initiative, aiming to expose black's monarch before the queenside can solidify. Unleashing a pawn storm against your king opens up critical avenues, but this defensive concession voluntarily rips open the king's shield, exposing it to a terrifying onslaught and inviting immediate tactical retribution. Suddenly, the white queen plunges into the chaotic battlefield, a bold declaration of intent to dismantle black's besieged king. This aggressive maneuver bypasses a more measured consolidation, aiming to exploit the king's exposed position and the newly opened diagonals before black can fully organize a defense or regroup their shattered pawns. The queen's arrival injects immediate, acute pressure, forcing black to react defensively and potentially creating opportunities for further tactical skirmishes. The desperate gambit of the e-pawn is a last-ditch attempt to disrupt white's imposing kingside presence and open lines of communication towards the exposed monarch. A desperate gamble to deny the queen's crucial entry, though it leaves the monarch exposed and utterly alone. A bold attempt to disrupt white's attacking formation, this move sacrifices a piece with the hope of opening crucial lines against the exposed enemy king. Unlocking the passed pawn's potential demands immediate attention. Sacrificing the bishop here is a calculated risk to disrupt black's formidable pawn wall and create counterplay before the queen gets too deeply entrenched in the defense. A potent counterattack is unleashed, aiming to dismantle the enemy king's sanctuary. The stark vulnerability of black's monarch, exposed by the recent pawn sacrifice on the kingside, now presents an immediate tactical opportunity. White's monarch, having found refuge on the g-file, has orchestrated a series of aggressive pawn pushes and piece repositionings that have culminated in this critical juncture. The immediate objective is to continue the pressure and exploit the weakened dark squares around the enemy king, aiming for a swift conclusion rather than allowing black any breathing room to consolidate their defensive setup. The king's exposed position offers a glimmer of hope, forcing the opponent into a desperate defensive posture as this audacious check probes for weaknesses and seeks to disrupt white's precarious advantage. Embracing the stark reality of the exposed monarch, white sidesteps the immediate skirmish and relocates to a safer square, a prudent retreat from the oncoming storm of the opponent's relentless queen and bishop battery. Exploiting the exposed king, this move ignites a desperate king hunt, aiming to break through the weakened pawn shield and deliver a swift checkmate with the discovered attack.